The steel wheels of the 6,000-ton freight locomotive screamed against the icy curved tracks of the northern pass, but the sound of grinding metal was still quieter than the memory of my father locking the front door while I was standing on the porch in the freezing rain. Before that night, I possessed a foolish, fragile hope that honesty could somehow melt the ice in people's hearts. Hey everyone, quick pause from the tracks. I really want to know where you are listening from today, so please drop your city or country in the comments down below. It helps the channel a lot. Alright, let's get back into the cab. I had imagined my parents being shocked, perhaps silent for a few days, but I always believed they would eventually look at me and remember I was still their son. Instead, my father stood in the narrow hallway with his arms crossed tightly against his chest. His face looked entirely hollow, stripped of any warmth I recognized. My mother sat on the edge of the dining chair, staring at the floor. She wasn't shedding tears over losing me. She was trembling because I had shattered her perfect image. "So you are telling me this is what you want to be?" my father asked, his voice devoid of any emotion, dropping into a cold, sharp register that made my stomach twist. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. My hands were vibrating against my sides, but I forced my chin up. "I am not choosing to be gay. I am just choosing to stop lying to you about it." My mother finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Do not speak about this like it is some normal occurrence under my roof." The anger from my father was a loud, aggressive fire, but my mother's shame was a suffocating smoke that filled the hallway until my lungs burned. I packed a single duffel bag that same hour. I did not take much: heavy canvas work pants, a few thermal shirts, my worn-out boots, and the sparse cash I had hidden in a jar. I walked out into the biting November air and listened to the deadbolt slide into place behind me. There was only one person I thought could anchor me. I walked 2 miles to a glowing public payphone outside a closed gas station. My fingers were entirely numb as I pushed the metal buttons, dialing the number of the boy who had promised me he felt the same way in the dark corners of his car just weeks prior. The phone rang 4 times. "Hello?" His voice crackled through the cheap plastic receiver. The wind howled around the metal booth. "It happened," I managed to say, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "They kicked me out." The line went completely dead with silence. I could hear his ragged breathing. "What do you want me to do?" he finally whispered, the panic evident in his trembling words. "Come to the station with me," I pleaded, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white. "We can leave, just like we talked about." "I cannot do that," he stammered quickly, the guilt dripping from every syllable. "I cannot lose my parents. I cannot be a pariah. I am sorry, I just cannot." I stared at the flickering fluorescent light of the gas station canopy. "You are choosing this, then?" I asked, my voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He began to cry, thick, ugly sobs through the receiver, but I did not wait for his apology. I placed the phone back on the hook. The metallic click echoed in the empty night. I spent the next 3 days sleeping in a hard plastic chair at a bus terminal, traveling as far north as my meager cash would allow, ending up in a dense, snow-covered mountain town built entirely around a massive freight rail yard. The smell of diesel fuel and raw pine sap hung heavy in the freezing air. I walked into the yard office, my boots leaving wet tracks on the linoleum, and asked the gruff, broad-shouldered yardmaster for any work he had. His name was Marcus. He possessed a thick gray beard and hands that looked like they were carved from stone. He looked at my shivering, exhausted frame and simply pointed to a pot of black coffee. Drink that before you freeze to my floor, kid. Over the next 2 years, Marcus taught me how to survive. He did not judge where I came from or why I flinched at loud noises. He saw a broken kid who needed a purpose, and he handed me a heavy manual on locomotive engineering. I started out sweeping the maintenance bays, then balancing air pressure valves, and eventually I earned my place in the operator seat of the massive freight trains carving through the hazardous mountain passes. The locomotive became my sanctuary. The rhythmic thumping of the engine block, the complex dance of the throttle and dynamic brakes, the sheer isolation of the snow-covered peaks. It kept my mind numb and my heart safely locked away. Then, on a brutal Tuesday morning in January, the dispatcher radioed that a corporate safety inspector was joining my route to assess the track integrity after a recent storm. I waited in the idling cab, checking the manifold pressures, when the heavy metal door creaked open. He stepped into the confined space, bringing a gust of freezing wind with him. He wore a pristine dark wool coat, completely out of place against the grease and grime of the rail yard. His expression was serious, his posture rigidly professional, and his eyes carried a heavy exhaustion that mirrored my own. "You must be the engineer," he said, his voice surprisingly calm and deep over the roar of the diesel engine. "Julian," I nodded, wiping a streak of oil off my heavy gloves. "Take a seat, Julian. Do not touch the red handles unless you want to derail 6,000 tons of steel." A faint, unexpected smirk ghosted across his face. "I will keep my hands to myself." For the first 4 hours of the journey, the cab was filled only with the deafening hum of the engine and the crackle of the dispatch radio. I focused entirely on the snowy tracks ahead, managing the delicate balance of braking a heavy train down a steep grade. But I could feel Julian watching me, not observing my technique, but truly watching me. When we reached a remote siding deep in the pine forest, a red signal forced us to a halt to let a high-priority train pass. The silence in the cab suddenly felt deafening. The snow began to fall heavily outside the reinforced glass. I reached into my bag and pulled out a dented metal thermos, pouring steaming black coffee into the heavy plastic cup. Without thinking, I offered it to him. Julian looked at the cup, then up into my eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a sharp, unfamiliar jolt straight through my chest. "Thank you," he murmured, wrapping his hands around the warm plastic. He took a slow sip, his gaze never leaving my face. "Marcus said you are the best operator in this sector. He also said you basically live in this rail yard." I leaned back against the control panel, crossing my arms defensively. "Marcus talks too much. I do my job." Julian lowered the cup, the steam curling between us. "Why do you isolate yourself out here? You are young. You could be anywhere." The question was direct, piercing through the armor I had spent 2 years building. I wanted to deflect, to tell him to mind his corporate paperwork, but something in his tired, genuine expression disarmed me. "I prefer the isolation," I said quietly, looking out at the endless white trees. "Trees do not make promises they cannot keep. Steel does not lie to you. When you push a throttle, the train moves. It makes sense." Julian shifted closer, the heavy fabric of his coat brushing against my canvas jacket. "People lie," he said, his voice dropping to a resonant murmur. "But not everyone runs away when the tracks get difficult." We sat in the dim light of the instrument panels for nearly an hour, the snow burying the world outside. I found myself telling him things I had buried deep in the frozen ground. I told him about the hallway, my father's cold eyes, the payphone in the wind, the boy who let me go to save his own skin. Julian did not interrupt. He did not offer empty, manufactured pity. He just listened with an intensity that made the cramped metal cab feel like the only safe place on earth. When the dispatch radio suddenly crackled back to life, clearing our signal to green, Julian slowly set the cup down. He reached out again, but this time, he deliberately rested his hand over mine on the steel throttle. His skin was warm. "I am glad you survived the cold," he said, looking deeply into my eyes. But you do not have to stay frozen forever. My breath hitched in my chest. The walls I had built were suddenly cracking, crumbling under the weight of his quiet sincerity. I slowly turned my hand over, threading my rough, calloused fingers through his smooth ones. We stayed like that for a long, quiet moment, the massive engine thrumming beneath our feet, before I finally pushed the throttle forward. We arrived back at the rail yard long after sunset. As we stepped down from the metal ladder onto the snowy gravel, the bitter wind howling around us, Julian did not walk toward the corporate office. He turned to me, the yellow yard lights casting long shadows across his face. "I am supposed to head back to the city tomorrow," he said softly, "but I think I need to inspect this route again, if you will have me." I looked at him, feeling the absolute terror and exhilarating warmth fighting inside me. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us, and kissed him. It was slow, hesitant, and incredibly real. It felt like the heavy, grinding brakes finally releasing, allowing my heart to move forward again. I really hope you enjoyed this journey on the tracks. What would you have done in this situation? Let me know in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe for more real stories.